Okay, then we have the next talk by Rahul. Please take it away.
Hi everyone, I'm Rahul. I'm a PhD student at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. And today I'd like to tell you about my work in collaboration with my advisor, Ethan Cecchetti, on how we are leveraging duality for programming in zkSNARKs. So zkSNARKs are these cool cryptographic tools that are used in a lot of privacy applications. I think the main application is that of cryptocurrencies and blockchains, where you may want to verify a transaction in some decentralized network. But these can also be used in authentication. So maybe you want to prove your identity, but you don't want to reveal sensitive information corresponding to your identity. And it can even be used in things like verifiable machine learning. For instance, if you have a model or a data set and you want to prove some property about that model or data set, but you don't want to reveal sensitive information about said model or data set, you can use zkSNARKs for that. And so there's been a lot of research on making zkSNARKs practical over the years. And that starts at this low level of making the cryptography more practical, which means making it more computationally tractable and more generalizable. And there's been a lot of recent work on building on this cryptography research to develop better library support and tooling to make it easier for developers to use these zkSNARKs. But I want to focus on this top part, that of building language abstractions. Specifically, I want to build abstractions that make it easier for the developer to specify what they want to do with zkSNARKs. And so that's what this talk is going to be about. It's about one way that we want to build a better language abstraction for zkSNARKs. So I've told you a little bit about what zkSNARKs are used for, but let's actually talk about what they are. So in this setting, a prover will claim that they know some information, in this case, maybe an x and a y, such that some predicate p is true on those inputs. And the goal in this scenario is we want the prover to convince the verifier that this predicate is true on the x and y, or more specifically, that they know this x and y such that the predicate is true. In a traditional proof of knowledge, the prover can just simply send this x and y to the verifier, and the verifier can then just run this predicate p on the given x and y. But we work in privacy land, so what if we want to keep certain inputs a secret from the verifier? So maybe we want to hide information about x from the verifier, but still prove that we know an x and a y such that this predicate is true. Well, that's where zkSNARKs comes in. So now, instead of sending the x and the y directly to the verifier, we tell the zkSNARK which inputs we want to treat as secret, which ones we want to treat as public, and the zkSNARK will generate a cryptographic proof, that's this pi thing, that the verifier can then check, such that when the verifier checks this proof, this will be a proof that the verifier then can check that this predicate p is true. But also we have this extra thing that the verifier learns nothing else about the secret x. And so that is what a zkSNARK is. So to see how zkSNARKs are used in an actual example, suppose we have a list of data. In this case, the list is of size 4. And this is data we want to keep secret from a verifier. And maybe we want to prove some predicate. And maybe you want to prove some predicate that the data is at that some data D2 is at the second location in the list. And so the standard way of doing this is to use what's called a Merkle tree, which is an authenticated data structure. And the way that we construct this data structure is first we start at the leaves, where the value of those leaves is simply just hashing the value of each of the corresponding data. Then we'll recursively compute these intermediate nodes, where the values are then just taking the hash of the left child, concatenated with the right child. And we do this recursively until we reach a root node, which is going to serve as basically a public identifier for this secret list. And so then what a verifier can do is it can recompute this root hash and then compare it against this public identifier. And if the two values match, then we know that is how we will prove this predicate p. But recomputing the entire tree is expensive. So what I want to point out is, let's see what are the nodes that rely on the value of D2. It's going to be these blue nodes that go up the path from this data to the root. So this motivates the following approach. First, we'll collect what are called these sibling hashes. These are these nodes in red, which correspond to the roots of the subtrees whose value does not depend in any way on D2. This is more generally, this is called collecting these an intermediate witness, because what we'll see is that this is actually, these sibling hashes are sufficient to actually verify the predicate P. Then we can give these sibling hashes to the verifier, who can then compute the hashes up the tree by first hashing D2, and then using the sibling hashes to then compute these hashes up this path. And this corresponds to the actual proof generation, or how you would actually verify this property. And so, like I said before, anyone with the sibling hashes and a hash of the data can then verify this predicate P. OK, and then so the way zkSNARKs then comes in is we can then use a zkSNARK to hide certain inputs. So for example, maybe we want to hide the location of this data from the verifier. We can use a zkSNARK to do that. So there are two things I really want to point out about this example. The first is that we have these two separate procedures, one for computing this intermediate witness and one for generating the proof. And the way these two things are, these procedures are actually performed, operate over the same path from the data, from the leaf node up to the hash, along this purple path that I've denoted here. So to drive this point home even further, I actually have the code that you would actually write to implement these two procedures, but I've abstracted a lot of the details out. And so for the rest of this talk, I'm going to be using a set of colors. So I'm going to include this color legend at the top right, where things that correspond to this first procedure, that of collecting these intermediate witnesses, are going to be in red. The things that correspond to generating the proof are going to be in blue. And things that correspond to both, I'll color in purple. And so the thing I want to point out about this code first is that there's actually some duplicate code. Like some of these lines are exactly the same across these two procedures. But more than that, I want to point out how there's sort of this duplicate structure where both of them have sort of the same control flow, where they're operating over a for loop, and then they branch based on this if statement that corresponds to operating over this path in purple that I had on the previous slide. OK, so why is this a problem? Well, duplication in general is kind of a problem because, especially in this case, we have two pieces of code that are sort of logically tied together in this particular way. And so if we want to change one, we also have to then change the other in a corresponding way. And if we don't do it properly, this can lead to inconsistencies and potentially buggy code. And typically, the way we would actually implement, the way we would solve duplication is to use some sort of abstraction in PL, right? Like we might use a function or a module to abstract out the commonalities. The difficulty is it's not really obvious how to pull out the commonalities into a single function. And the last thing is I've been using this particular example, but this sort of duality where we have these two procedures with similar control flow is a pattern that exists in many programs that are when you use zkSNARKs. So hopefully now that I've convinced you this is a problem, how do we solve this problem? And that's what I hope to answer in this talk. So we have these two code pieces, these two procedures. And ideally, we'd like some way to sort of merge them into a single procedure, or a single representation, really a single code block that only has these control flow elements written out once, but then have a way to specify both computing the witness and generating the proof. OK, but if we have this combined block, how do we determine which parts correspond to which procedure? And what I mean by that is, on the slide, I have this color legend, and I have these colors. But in an actual piece of code, it's just a set of text. So we need some way for the developer to specify which lines of code correspond to which procedure. And the insight that we came up with is simply we allow the developer to annotate their code with these labels. And so we have three labels, one for C that corresponds to computing the witness, P for proof generation, and then the label CP for both. And what we can do is we specifically only have these labels on variable declarations. So the developer specifies what variables correspond to what procedure. But then we can use this to learn what lines correspond to what procedures using these labels. So for example, if our for loop, if the iterator variable is annotated with the label CP, then we know that that for loop should exist in both procedures. And I hope this is also something that is relatively conceptually straightforward for the developer to annotate. OK, great. So now the developer annotates the variable declarations with these labels. What do we do with this block? Because this is something that the developer now has, but we need to turn this into something executable, something that can be run on an actual machine. Well, this is the workshop for secure compilation. Let's define a compiler. So here's how the compilation pass is going to work. The compiler is going to be defined by these projections, where these projections are basically just extracting out the relevant code portions for that particular procedure. So in this case, we might have a projection for computing the witness that extracts out everything that is either red or purple. Or we might have one, and then we also have one for extracting the relevant code for proof generation, which will be the code that is in blue and purple. And what's nice is we show that these projections can be completely defined from the annotations that the developer specifies. So then to define the full compilation pass, it's simply just running these two things sequentially, right? Because we first want to compute these witnesses. That's the stuff in red. And then we want to then use the witnesses to then generate the proof, which corresponds to the stuff in blue. But projections may not always be defined based on how the developer annotates its code. And to see that, let's consider this example, where we have two variables, one that's annotated with the label P, and a variable Y that's annotated with the label C. Intuitively, if we sort of just project the colors naturally, we have that the variable Y is projected as part of the computing witness procedure, and then the assignment to X is projected for the proof generation. But the problem here is that this variable X, while it was defined earlier in the combined block, is actually defined later based on how we define the full compilation pass. So when we actually run this code, X is not defined. And so this piece of code that we've actually tried to compile to is not well defined. So we want to reject this type of thing. And really, we want to prevent this behavior where red and blue, we don't want to prevent red and blue data from influencing each other. What we show is that this can actually be enforced by a type system. So we developed a modal type system that basically just prevents the mixing of red and blue data. And then this is what allows us to then define these projections properly. So we have this combined block. We've defined how it's actually compiled. But we want to also talk about what the behavior of this combined block is. So what is a reasonable semantics for this? A first step is to look at what it compiles to. And really what we could do is we could just define the semantics entirely by what it's actually compiled to. So we can just say the semantics of this combined block is just running the red thing followed by running the blue thing. But there's a problem here, which is that this is very difficult for a developer looking at this combined block to reason about. Right? It's very highly non-local, because if we define the semantics in this way, the programmer has to reason about out-of-order execution. Right? Because if we have a statement in blue immediately followed by a statement in red, even though the statement in red appears later, it's actually going to be executed first because of how we define the full compilation process. So we want a more natural surface semantics. So I guess a question is, what happens if we define a more natural in-order semantics? Is this even something that is reasonable to do? And so if we have a surface semantics in this way, we would want to prove some sort of correctness condition. In this case, we would prove an adequacy notion, right? Where if we were to run our program according to the surface semantics and then compile that value down, this should match exactly with if we first compiled this block and then run the post-projected semantics after. So so this actually turns out to be difficult to prove because of what I was just talking about on the last slide, which is because of this non-locality. So the typical way you would prove adequacy, which is using lockstep by simulation, is actually insufficient because of this non-locality. But we actually do strongly believe we have a natural in-order semantics that is adequate with respect to the semantics of what it's compiled to. But this is ongoing work. We still have yet to prove that this is true. Another thing we strongly believe is true is this property is a property of robust compilation called robust relational hyperproperty reservation. And Nicholas actually talked earlier, had this great talk about robust compilation, but I'll review specifically about RRHP, which basically is just says that compilation preserves relational hyperproperties. And so what this means is, suppose we have a set of relations that is satisfied by the code that gets compiled. This is going to be a set of relations over behaviors or hyperproperties. We want to show that the set of relations of our original block is exactly the same set of relations that hold on the code that gets compiled. And actually, more than that, we want to prove that in arbitrary context, the set of relations is actually preserved. Now, this seems like a pretty strong property. In fact, it's the strongest correctness condition in the robust compilation hierarchy. OK, so how would we actually go about proving this? We would prove a formula like we would prove a formal property like the following, which says that for any target context, we need to be able to construct a back translation to a source context that satisfies the following property: that for all partial programs, the behavior, which is just really the set of possible traces of our compiled program in this target context, in this arbitrary target context, should exactly match the behavior of our program in this back-translated source context. And so if you want to have an intuitive way to think about this is that really that the visible impacts of the thing we're compiling from and to are exactly the same. OK, so we need a couple of things to actually prove this. We haven't actually written down the proof for this, so this is more of a proof sketch. But first, we need a notion of what partial programs are. Well, we can just simply use these combined blocks that we defined as our partial programs. And then the source and target context is just going to be the rest of the code that surrounds it. Because this is the only actual compilation part this is the only actual interesting part of the compilation. Because a note I do want to make here is the syntax for the source language and the target language are basically the same, except the source language also has this additional combined block abstraction. We also need to define what behaviors are in our case, and that means defining what traces are. And so one approach we could take is that we could just treat traces as sequence of heap states defined by both our source and target semantics that we came up with. So then proving this equivalence of behaviors comes down to proving equivalence of these traces. That adequacy will be able to help us prove this equivalence. And then finally, to actually finish the proof sketch, we would need a back translation. And we actually think the identity function will work because remember, in the compilation process, the only interesting compilation is that of this combined block. Everything else that's not in one of these combined blocks gets compiled to itself. So that's why we think the identity function will work here. And like I said, this is just a rough proof sketch. This is also ongoing work, but we suspect that our compilation will actually satisfy this property of RRHP. OK, so to summarize, first we design this new, hopefully pretty cool abstraction. We hope that it promotes modularity, and it removes duplication by allowing the developer to specify a single combined block that we then define how to then compile it to something executable. There's also ongoing work specifically on how to prove notions of semantic equivalence. And so in this case, we strongly suspect, but still need to prove that our semantics are adequate and our compilation satisfies this RHP property. And just to bring this back full circle, we hope that our work will build on the work of many others and be yet another step towards making zkSNARKs practical and easier to use. So thank you, and with that, I'm happy to take questions.
And right? Yeah. Okay.
Hi. So I'm slightly confused with that setup. So you're requiring the user to annotate the initial variables
Yes.
with C and P.
Yes.
And you're entering the computation label, like you're entering labels for the computational steps.
Sorry.
Is that how I should
let me
understand?
pull this up. You're talking about this slide, right?
Right. And I thought you also mentioned that you only require the users to annotate the variables. So by variables, I'm assuming it's like introductory, like when you're declaring the
variable
variables.
declarations, yes.
And what about these steps? Like, are you entering or are you requiring the user to actually annotate? How is it?
So okay, so I guess you're talking about the 3 lines that I have the labels on in this example.
Right, like, so who gives C, CP?
So these are the variable declarations in our case.
Oh, so there's no explicit variable declaration.
No.
I see. So the user actually goes and annotate the code.
Yes.
The computational steps of the code, not just. Oh, I see. On the other hand, I was just thinking, like, if you have like a variable declaration and you specify like these belong to this, and then you might be able to infer the code dependencies automatically, right? I'm sure like it's not that trivial, but I'm just wondering if you have thought about that.
Sorry, can you clarify what you mean by dependencies?
So in this case, you showed an example where the straight projection is not sufficient to handle the dependencies because you have y equal to x plus 5, but then x doesn't appear in that block.
Yeah.
So to me, it seems like you can handle this automatically by constructing the dependencies, and so you can move the block x equal to 2 as well.
Yeah, okay, yeah, no, actually you're right. So I think in something like a core calculus, we might say, oh, the developer has to annotate every variable declaration. But we haven't shown this, but we actually do think that you can actually infer the labels as you mentioned.
Yeah.
And really, I think the way you would do this is that you would just, at the top of this combined block, any variables that go in, you would have to explicitly annotate with these labels. But then any variable you later declare can then be inferred in the way you mentioned, right? Like, so example, if we're defining y to be x plus 5, if we know that, well, in this case, I don't know exactly what that would be. But like, we could say, oh, this variable y also needs to be accessible at p.
Yeah.
Right? And so inferring it in the way that you just mentioned. I think that would be possible.
So in that case, like the block y equal to x plus 5, it would get both p and c labels, right?
Yeah. Well, so I think if we were to automatically infer it, it would only say, like, just in this particular like restricted example, it would just say it has to have p. But depending on how it's used later, it might also then say like, oh, it also has to have the label c as well.
Right, and then the combined blocks get more than one variable, right? So why doesn't a simple projection work? Or maybe I'm completely misunderstand. Like once you infer the complete labels for a block, just not like C and P, you get like combined labels for each computational block. And then you could project that, right? Or
I'm sorry, I don't know if I fully
or maybe I can take it offline.
Sure,
that's fine.
yeah, I'm happy to.
I was wondering if you could compare this to some of the prior work. So there was a Geppetto system that just, you wrote one version of C, and then it would interpret it as either running locally or running in verification mode or running in proof mode.
I'm unfortunately not familiar with that. What was it called?
Geppetto.
Geppetto, okay. I'd be happy to talk about this more offline. Unfortunately, I can't. Like, I would like to discuss that with you because I'm not familiar with Geppetto.
There's also a zkSNARK, I think, from Elaine Shee's group.
I'm sorry, I don't, yeah.
I have a question about the language. So
yes,
the blocks you are talking about, they don't have control flow. It's just the assignments, or?
So the blocks will include control flow, but we don't require the developer to annotate any of the control flow. It's just the developer only needs to annotate the variable let's say the variable declarations for this.
Because the control flow is by default in both the same, right?
Actually, so we not necessarily. In this case, we infer that from the fact that the loop iterator is given the label CP. So if the loop iterator only had the label C, we would then only project it to the compute portion. So it's inferring it based on the labels of the variables involved.
Okay, so the computing witness and the proof generation program, they can have different control flow structure.
They can, yeah.
Okay,
Yes.
interesting.
So they can, and so for example, I think in the original block that I had, it had like you could, for instance, have inside maybe this if statement some more control flow that corresponds just to the computing witness portion. It just so happens that because the logic between computing this witness and then using that to generate the proof, the logic is so intertwined that the control flow in a lot of the examples we've seen sort of just match up.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah.
Okay, I also have one more question. So what you're describing, like it seems in some sense quite general, right? Like the idea that you annotate some parts of the program and then you generate two programs out of that.
Yeah.
Like, do you think you can also apply this to other setting than zkSNARKs, or is there something specific to zkSNARKs that you're using here?
I think some of the design, some of the specifics that maybe are beyond the scope of this talk are specific to zkSNARKs, but this idea of merging these like these patterns into the single block, I don't see why that can't be generalizable and used in other applications.
Yeah. Okay. Okay, then let's thank the speaker again.